So in addition to Caleb dressing up his dog for Halloween as a bumblebee, Caleb also said, somewhat in passing, this team is better suited to win in November than one I can remember. And I didn't mean for that to rhyme. But, Jimmy, what do you make of this team and the way it's built in terms of winning in November and setting themselves up for a college football playoff spot and maybe even a really good one?
I think they are set up to have a really good November. Typically, defense travels. And so when you go on the road, your defense is typically going to play well. Offensively, they've been up and down. I have been encouraged by that second half against Alabama. It seemed like Nico found himself a little bit. The offense found itself. You ended up having 0 points in the first half, but then 24, in the second half. So I saw a spark in the offense. I saw Nico playing better after he got waylaid. Looked like he came out of the game for a play when he was hurt. I think he's going to play better in the second half. I think the defense will continue to rank among the nation's best. I like Tennessee's running attack. They lead the SEC in rushing. That's another thing that typically travels. So I think Tennessee is going to have a very strong November.
Jimmy, I'll compare it to 2022 as well, when Tennessee was in the hunt for a 4-team college football playoff. I didn't think defensively they could get much better. I just thought they were limited in personnel. I could see, the defense is elite this year. I could see the offensive passing game clicking and kind of finding their rhythm more so than I could have ever seen that group in 2022 play defense.
Yeah, I think so. The 2022 defense was limited, and they gave up. The South Carolina game was an abomination, but they gave up points and yards to other teams as well. If I'm not mistaken, Florida had over 500 yards against Tennessee, and Tennessee won after when Florida got an onside kick late and then was trying to throw it in the end zone. But I agree with that. I think this the Tennessee passing attack they look good early against non-competitive teams, but then they look good against Alabama in the second half, and that's the thing that I think will carry over. I've mentioned many times that Nico's not a finished product. I think he'll get better and better. I think he'll get better and better toward the end of this season. And so I do think the passing attack has a better chance of showing significant improvement versus the defense of 2022.
So, Jimmy, and the reason I brought this up is, I talked about the defensive line and the depth, and I totally agree with you. One of my theories in football is that X's and O's versus Jimmy's and Joe's, everybody always talks about that. X's and O's has more weight and power in September, but Jimmy's and Joe's start to carry more and more weight as the season goes on, and particularly when you get into November, and Tennessee has those. The other theory I have, and I want you guys to both jump in on this. I'll start with you, Jimmy, but Dave, you've covered a lot of teams. My brother brought this up to me recently, of all people. Isn't it true that if you have a good defense at the beginning of the year, you're going to have a good defense? The offense can get better. So wouldn't you rather start the year with a good defense and a bad offense, knowing the offense can get better? Because isn't it true that if you start with a good offense and a bad defense, you don't really see a defense improve as the season goes on?
Yeah, that's a good theory. I think there's something to that. Of course, there are exceptions, but I think in general, you would rather start with a really good defense. One of the keys to that whole equation is the injury situation. And Tennessee on defense, they've got pretty darn good depth, in particular on the defensive line. They don't have depth, in my opinion, on the offensive line. Their depth at receiver is a little bit questionable to me. But I think that's true, that typically a team offensively will get better as the season goes on. But if you're bad on defense early, you're typically going to be bad the whole year.
No, I agree with that. You mentioned the receivers. We were led to believe they were going to be as deep as the defensive line. I don't think that's proven to be the case.
Nope.
Chaz Nimrod's a big drop-off. The Tennessee receivers, if you want to say Brew McCoy with the finger/hand, if you want to say Squirrel White with the shoulder, Dante Thornton left the game early with a lowered leg. That to me is the key for a strong run in November. What would you pick as the key for a strong run in November?
Well, it would be the passing game. And so you could attribute that to the receivers. You could attribute that to Nico being more accurate, making the right decision, throwing it to the right people. I mean, he had one play. Now, he overthrew some passes against Alabama, but at one point, Nimrod's defender fell down. Nimrod's wide open, and Nico threw it to – who did he throw it to? Chris Brazel. Mm-hmm. And there's nobody on Nimrod. He's got to see the field better in that regard. He's got to make sure that he hits the open receiver and finds the open receiver. But I think it's a combination of that. But I think, to me, it starts with the receivers. The receivers have got to do a good job. They can't drop passes. They got to get open. They got to get separation. They got to be on the same page with the quarterback, and Nico's got to hit them. But that, to me, will define whether or not Tennessee makes a significant run and finishes on a high note in November.
Yep, I agree with all that you just said. Caleb?
Yeah, and I know the old Johnny Major saying they remember what you do in November. That was very easy for Johnny Majors and Philip Fulmer to say when they were playing Vanderbilt in Kentucky every year. So that's one of the stupidest stats in history is when people talk about how great Tennessee's been in November. But Jimmy, I do want to ask too, let's take it beyond November into December and January when you talk college football playoff. That even favors Tennessee more, right? Because the deeper and deeper and deeper you go and the colder and colder it gets, the more a defensive line is an advantage, isn't it?
A defensive line's an advantage, a run game's an advantage. So those two things, yes. So I think that does play into Tennessee's hands. And gosh, Tennessee's defensive line goes 12 deep. I've mentioned this before. They have had better starters on the defensive line with #1 draft picks. They have never been this deep on the defensive line in the 40 years I've covered them. So that's a big advantage. Dylan Sampson is a big advantage. He's the best running back in the SEC, one of the best running backs in the country. And so I think that's also helpful. And you're gonna probably have some, unless you're playing in a dome, you're gonna have some bad weather games along the way during the playoffs. So I think that's important to have a great defense and a really good run game.
Jimmy, let me ask you this: as a Heisman voter, and I think you're over all the voters in Tennessee, but why has Dylan Sampson not gotten more talk about the Heisman? I'm not saying he should necessarily go to New York or even win it, but it just seems like he's been conspicuously absent in the conversation.
Yeah, I don't know the reason for that. He should be in that conversation. I know that you got a running back at Boise State that's lighting it up. And he deserves to be get consideration. Right now, he deserves to be in New York. But when you start looking at other prospects, give me another running back that's been better than Dylan Sampson. There's a guy at Iowa that's having a great year, Caleb Johnson. Other than that,
Ashton Genty, who's having a historic.
No, that's what I meant. That's what I was talking about.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I was referring to. Yeah, I just didn't mention his name. I said his school. Sorry. But then look at the quarterbacks. I mean, it was Milroe for a little while, and then he's faded off. Carson Beck for a little while, he's faded off. Quinn Ewers, he got hurt, came back, hadn't played as well. To me, the best quarterback probably is Cam Ward at Miami. Okay?
Probably.
Yeah, I think he's the
Dylan Gabriel at Oregon. Those two are probably the two best quarterbacks. And Sampson, to me, there's not a wide receiver I would put in that category. To me, Dylan Sampson should be in about the top 6 on the Heisman list. Why he's not, I don't know. He should be. And certainly he would get strong consideration on my ballot.
Jimmy, great stuff as always. How do we follow your work?
Well, on Off the Hook.
Yeah,
you can do it there. And we're writing, trying to write a couple of columns a week for you. Also, we're doing the podcast. Our most recent one, we're going to do one. I happened at the Quarterback Club to interview Omar Norman Lott and Will Brooks. So we're going to do that as one of our podcasts. Then I interviewed Daryl Dickey, who told me a story I'd never heard, probably should have known it. I knew he was a 6-year player. I didn't know why. I knew he was 24 years old. I didn't know why he was there that long. He was involved in a tackling drill in 1980 when he came as a freshman. Broke his leg in a tackling drill, and then withdrew they hadn't started school, so he did not enroll in school. And that allowed him to be a 6-year player. Otherwise, if he hadn't broken his leg, he'd have never been on the 1985 team and never helped them win the Sugar Bowl.
That's a great story. And And for those that don't know, when you enroll in school is when your clock starts.
Yes.
So, but practice preseason camp will begin before that. And then I know this weird rule because of a guy named Lane Kiffin that if you spend the night on campus, do you remember that rule when he left, that if you spend the night, you're then tied to your scholarship if you spend the night on campus?
I didn't. Is that really a rule, or is that a rule?
really is a rule?
I thought Dave was going somewhere else with a Lane Kiffin rule about spending the night, and I didn't want to know what he was referring to.
You spend the night with a Lane Kiffin, you probably should go to the doctor and get checked out.